Hey, everybody, welcome to Arbitrary and Capricious, a podcast where we talk about whatever we feel like. I'm your host, Jay Reed.
And I'm Aaron Robinson.
Hey, Aaron, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing very well. How are you today?
I'm doing all right. What do you got to talk about today?
Well, first off, I definitely want to talk about the West Virginia statewide teacher strike, which has caused the public schools in West Virginia to be closed all week last week. What about you? What do you want to talk about?
I'd like to talk about two things that I don't like very much, and those are corruption and basketball. I don't know how much you've been watching, but there's been a scandal developing in the NCAA surrounding college basketball, and I want to kind of go into that and talk about what it means for college sports and really what college sports says about America. I'm
That
looking
sounds
forward to
very
that.
interesting. And I think we also want to talk about guns again because a lot of things happened this week since our last podcast. And
Mhm.
just to let everyone know, today is, I believe, was it March
March 4th.
4th, March 4th, 2018, a week from our last podcast. And before we get going on these new and exciting topics, let's talk about old news. Do we have any old news that we want to go over?
Yeah, I've got a little bit of old news. Last week, we mentioned briefly NATO, and we discussed the structure of NATO and whether or not uh, other NATO allies would have to come to the aid of an attacked ally, if you remember about that. So I wanted to go into that real fast. I looked into it during this week, and you had asked, does the attack to the ally have to be from a state actor? Does it have to be the Syrian army as opposed to that
ISIS.
less formal group? Exactly. Well, the answer is, we don't really know because that part of the treaty has only ever been triggered once. And I was just curious to see if you had a guess to when that one triggering of the NATO convention would be.
All right. This feels like a shot in the dark, probably because it is, but I'm going to go with Korea.
Okay, good guess. Good guess.
Um,
Korea was actually that was a UN action.
it was.
The one time that the Article 5 of the NATO treaty was triggered was actually October 2001, following the September 11th attacks.
Oh,
The
yeah, the
United States,
coalition of the willing.
exactly, the United States triggered Article 5 of the treaty, asking for aid in their war on terror. Specifically, that was the structure for the coalition going into Afghanistan. So to answer the question about does it have to be a state actor? Well, clearly no.
Well,
Given that the one time it was used.
but remember, the Taliban was a ruling party in Afghanistan. So I think there's at least an argument to be made that they were essentially the Afghani government at that point in time. So, I mean, at that point, are they a state? I think there's at least an argument that you could say, yes, they were the state. And we just kind of demolished them to the point where now they were, you know, just a terrorist organization out in the desert. I think it's actually more mountains than desert in Afghanistan, but
But did the Taliban attack the United States on September 11th? And I think the answer to that is no.
I thought, okay, I guess you're right. But they were a part of it. I don't remember, man.
They were sheltering Al Qaeda. That was the basis for the attack on Afghanistan.
We go to war for really stupid reasons in America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But to back up, go back to NATO. This is one of those areas that concerns international law, and international law is a fascinating area because there is just so little case law. There are just so many, or I'm sorry, there are so few international cases that most of the questions about international law, the real answer is, you know what? We don't know until it happens.
Well, I think also, if you look at it, international law with countries like the United States or any of the rogue nations, Korea, Iran, Syria, whatever you want to call them, they don't always obey international. It's sad that I have to include the United States, but I know for a fact that they've never submitted to the International Criminal Court. So we're not a part of that tribunal. So we can't be tried if we violate international criminal laws, which is, I think, a ridiculous thing. But it really comes back to how do you enforce it without some type of one world organization to enforce it on a country? It's voluntary.
You're absolutely right. That's the catch with international law is that it's really only as good as the parties are willing to enforce it. Where there's no sheriff, there's no constable to go enforce the judgment. It's just completely up to really the party that loses. And the whole idea is that if you do not comply with the judgment, then other countries in the future will be discouraged from complying with judgments when you win. But unfortunately, as you mentioned, sometimes you get an extremely powerful party like the United States, or you get a rogue state like North Korea, where they just decide to ignore the judgment and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, so I have some old news that I'd like to bring up as well.
All right, what do you got?
So we talked about whether or not Trump was going to run. I think both of us felt like it's a possibility, but he's a little in over his head. I believe after we had that conversation, he announced that he would be running for a second term, and in fact filed the paperwork back, I think, the week after his inauguration. So he's been planning to run for a second term the entire time. And that terrifies me. But it also brings up an interesting question in my mind, whether or not the Republicans are going to allow him to remain as an incumbent. I mean, is there anything against the Republicans saying, you know what, we don't support you anymore, you're not really a Republican, we're going to put up Jeb Bush again? Or are they stuck with Trump since he won last time?
I mean, there's nothing that's going to compel them to use Trump again, but I think they will. He won, and he continues to have a base of support. So I would be very, very surprised if the Republicans put up a different candidate. Of course, they're going to have a primary. Of course, they're going to have an election, but I think Trump's going to win it.
Well, this is interesting because, the Democrats have flipped, was it like 49 seats since the Trump election in special elections around the United States? That's a wave, and 2018 is literally around the corner. We have the election this November, and I think that the Republican Party is going to have some soul searching to do after that election. I mean, I think that we could all say that, don't count your eggs before they hatch, and the Democrats have misread things before and have not acted properly and quickly on, opportunities. But still, 49 special elections in deep red states, that's pretty crazy. That's not something that I've ever remember happening in my lifetime.
Yeah, it's something that's been going on in Texas too is that Ted Cruz is up for election this midterm, and the Democrat who's in the lead to challenge him is a guy named Beto O'Rourke, and there's been a lot of chatter about him because supposedly his fundraising so far has outstripped Ted Cruz. So it'll be interesting to see if here in Texas whether or not there is that kind of change, or is this just going to be another a false dawn where they're saying Texas is going blue and then nothing happens.
Well, we are at a cultural crossroads politically. The Republican Party is redefining itself. The Democrats clearly have to redefine themselves after this last election. I feel like the Democrats, even though they lost, it wasn't just a loss. Their infrastructure was demolished. Hillary Clinton was kind of the bedrock of the Democratic Party for a while. And without her there now, they're having to completely rebuild. We have Bernie, but he's very old. And we have Elizabeth Warren, but she's doing amazing things in the Senate. But, who's going to be the one running against Trump? Who is the person that we actually need to have be the face of this opposition, if you will? And I don't know. That's the thing is it's 2018. We're going to be talking about the presidency as soon as this election is over in November. So who are the Democrats going to put forward? Who are they going to jump behind? Now, I know my father would say, and he loves saying this, that it's probably going to be one of the Castro brothers from San Antonio. So that's probably a safe bet. They're very popular, very smart, both have experience in the executive branch. So that might be something worth watching. But I don't know. What about you? What do you think, Jay?
Well, this actually might be a topic for another day, but what I am hoping for is a fracturing of the American political base where we break out of this two-party system. And I really feel like it's in the hands of the young people to start a movement that competes with these two tired and useless parties. I As for who's going to run for the Democrats, I really don't know. I think Elizabeth Warren is probably the most likely candidate. I've actually never heard of these Castro brothers, and I'd be very interested to know what they're about. But I'm hoping for a third option that isn't Mark Zuckerberg. So
I'm hoping for a third option that's not the Libertarian Party, because that's not a third option.
Yeah. Right.
So I'm not trying to be mean to libertarians, but no offense, I don't think that your theories are actually useful in governance. So I have no shame in hiding my opinion. I'm not really hiding my opinion. I mean, sharing my opinion about libertarians. So now that was the old news. Let's move on. We have a lot to talk about today, and I'm really interested in these topics. First off, let's start with West Virginia. So nationwide, we have a terrible public education system. Like, the United States has fallen so far behind all over the world. Now, our higher education system may be a lot better than a lot of places, but public education really has not been on the forefront of the American political spectrum for a long time. And we clearly need to change that. But one of the problems, and this is something that I remember from as long as I can remember, is that teachers in our country are underpaid. A lot of times, if you're a teacher, that means you maybe work 2 or 3 jobs, and that's not really something I think people want to do. They want to be able to have families and have hobbies and stuff like that. And these are the people that we are sending to essentially raise the next generation of people who will run this country. So this is something that should be very important to everyone. Now, in West Virginia, they have some of the lowest paid teachers in the union. The 48th lowest state in the union, in fact, in teacher pay. They make about $45,000 a year, and that's about $5,000 to $20,000 less than the teachers in the surrounding state. So, due to the hardships of the economy, and I guess generally due to the increasing healthcare costs, the teachers began to complain about their pay and their benefits and compensation. And the state started to talk about an increase, but ultimately failed to pass one. So the teachers decided to take things into their own hands, and they actually walked out, and 20,000 teachers went to the Capitol of West Virginia and protested throughout the week. Now, to me, this is really crazy because that closed down all 55 counties in West Virginia. No public schools were open all week last week. So this is a serious issue, and it doesn't look like it's been resolved yet. The House did pass an increase, but apparently the 5% raise was scrapped in favor of a 2% raise for 2018, a 1% increase for the next 2 years. And the teachers were like, that's not enough. That barely covers our, cost of living increases. And it doesn't address their biggest issue, which is their increasing healthcare cost. Now, kind of a side note, I believe that West Virginia might be one of the states that didn't expand Medicare, Medicaid under the Obamacare mandate. So this might also, be a little bit of a self-inflicted wound from the legislature standpoint.
It's a troubling situation to think that the entire public school system of a state has just shut down for an entire week.
Well, and also that it doesn't look like it's been resolved yet. I mean, Friday, right. I believe that the House bill went to the Senate, the state Senate, on Thursday. Instead of voting on the issue, they actually referred it over to the State Finance Commission. And instead of addressing it, they actually shelved it and said that they weren't going to view it in the morning session. And then that they weren't going to be coming back on Thursday afternoon. And so apparently Friday, still nothing had been passed. So we're now entering the second week of a statewide teacher strike. These are public servants, And honestly, this is going to be very disruptful for families all across the state. That's
Absolutely.
going to disrupt the industry, the economy. This is something that needs to be addressed. And honestly, if you don't have the money to pay them, you need to do something. And this is why taxes are important. West Virginia, you got Trump in office. He's pro coal, right? You're like the coal capital of the nation. Tax them. They just fired everybody anyways and automated it. Tax them. They're not helping your state out. Do something about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I took a quick look at some articles about the story this morning, and there were some developments from last night where the Senate actually offered the teachers a 4% raise, because I believe the teachers are asking for 5%. The Senate offered 4, and the teachers still turned it down because they're still saying, we want 5%. And the Senate actually somehow bungled their vote, where when they voted on it, they in fact passed a version of the bill that included the 5% raise asked for. And so for a moment, it looked like they were actually giving the teachers what they wanted, and they had to walk it back and figure out how they were going to, through their parliamentary procedures, nullify that bill that they just screwed up. And from what I was reading, like you're saying, it's now going to a conference committee, and it's nobody's expecting the teachers to go back tomorrow, which is a Monday. And from what I was reading, the difference between the 4% and the 5% raise was, what I read was $13 million. So just maybe I'm not doing this correctly, but if a 1% raise is $13 million, then a 5% raise is going to be about $65 million. And the question really is, as a state, as a fully functioning state, how can you not find $65 million to pay your teachers?
Well, and this gets back to this whole idea of small government. Like, the government needs to provide certain services. Public school is one of those things. These are the people who are going to be running the country in the future. You need to have people who are equipped, that have, faculties and all the equipment necessary to actually teach these people. Because, I don't really want people that don't know the difference between, the Jupiter, Mars, Uranus, science, math, all these things. We have been electing these type of people, and they are holding us back as a nation. Like, we need to stop that. And education has to be the first place that we address it.
This is an interesting issue to me, because it feels like it's really almost emotionally, morally one-sided. It's like, who is really going to get on the other side and say, no, we do not need to pay these teachers more?
Well, I think that the anti-intellectual in America will probably be saying that. These people who are like, well, these public schools are indoctrinating our children. They're teaching them liberalism. This is such a ridiculous and tired argument. I mean, even the conservatives understand that education is important. That's why they tried to change the textbooks in Texas. They tried to remove things from the history books so that they could, tailor their narrative. We just need to have a good education system. Quit getting down and trying to indoctrinate people. Let's actually hire people who are qualified to do the job and pay them. This is something that we need to do. This is why China is going to be the superpower of the next, century. The United States is going to be a retired empire. It's because we don't educate our people. And I'm not saying our people are necessarily dumb. There are a lot of them, and I apologize if you're one of the dumb ones listening, but we have potential. America has always been the land of opportunity. Well, why are you not extending the opportunity to everyone? Let's make this place a great place. Make America great again. Start with the schools. Bernie had that down, packed. Start with the schools. Fix our education.
Well, let me give you an opportunity to give a hot take, but what are your thoughts on homeschooling?
Historically, I've not been a fan of homeschooling, but a lot of that has to do with socialization. I feel that people who are homeschooled, and I have lots of friends that are homeschooled, so maybe this is just my own anecdotal opinion, but there tends to be some problems with socialization. Like, people have issues in social situations. They don't understand how to read social cues. And I think that public schools and maybe even private schools to some lesser degree help prepare you for the real world with dealing with other people, you know, people with different perspectives, different opinions, different worldviews, political views, religious views, whatever. Whereas when you're homeschooled or if you're in a private school where that diversity is limited, I feel like you shortchange the kid. And so I don't feel that homeschooling or private schooling is a solution to our problem. I feel like addressing the issues in the public school is how we're going to fix this nation, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'd agree with all of that, and I will acknowledge that I come from I was very privileged in this area because I just happened to grow up in an area that had excellent public schools,
Same here.
and so it was I was never forced into the lose-lose scenarios that a lot of people are put into, where they have awful public schools and they don't have the money to send them to a better school. But I think that there there's value in education far beyond what you learn in the classroom, and it's exactly what you were saying about the socialization. It's the introduction to people who have lives different from your own and have perspectives different from your own, and I'd say that's 75% of the value of going to school,
Well,
is being
well,
put into contact with those people.
it's kind of like what they tell us at law school is that you don't go to law school to learn how to practice law. You go to law school to learn how to think like a lawyer. You know, the practice part comes in practicing, going and actually doing it. And so I feel like part of that, the public education system, yeah, you're not going to remember calculus. I don't use calculus, you know, I took business calculus. I've never used it since then. But what was the benefit? Well, number one, to see if I liked calculus, to see if I liked all these different types of, you know, things out there that's amazing in the world to explore, but also to show me the different types of people in this world. You know, there's opportunity there. And I feel like when you're in a more close knit, closed minded society, you miss out on the diversity that makes this country great. And I feel like that's part of the problem is we have a faction of America that has embraced multiculturalism, diversity, whatever. And there's a part that is saying, well, that's not the America that got started, or that's not the way that our parents had it. Well, you know, that's true. The world has changed. We all don't live in Europe anymore. And, you know, we have airplanes and we can travel across the world in a matter of hours instead of a matter of months. I mean, the world is changing. And the question is, do we want to make it better or do we want to make it worse? That's how I feel. And really that comes back to the education. We have to teach people these things. You know, I've said for a long time, I personally think that all Americans should learn the Constitution in school, in public schools, so that whenever they graduate, they understand what their rights are. And when a politician gets up and says something ridiculous, they can say, well, that violates the Constitution. That violates the founding document of our country. You know, a smart electorate is going to make a smarter political process.
That's absolutely right, and that illustrates the value of education and the real dire need for better investment in our future. But to bring it back to West Virginia, there I wanted to talk about a couple of examples of other states who have faced similar problems.
Okay.
The two states I wanted to talk about were first Oklahoma, which is an example of how not to do things, and then another would be Rhode Island, which for the moment is making some gains. First to talk about Oklahoma, they have a similar problem with their teachers, where they are severely underpaid, and I've read that the teachers are just being poached from Oklahoma school districts by the other states. Apparently, the Dallas Independent School District has unashamedly set up recruiting stations in Oklahoma City and Tulsa to recruit away Oklahoma teachers because they can make $10,000 to $20,000 more just by crossing the border. And the problem in Oklahoma is that they have set constitutional limits on raising taxes, where in order to raise taxes at all in the state of Oklahoma, it takes 3/4 of the legislature to vote for it. 75%. And if it's just impossible to get 3/4 of a legislature, I keep saying that wrong, 3/4 of a legislature to vote for raising taxes.
Yeah,
And many school
especially
districts know
especially in a red state such as Oklahoma, which is deep
exactly.
red.
And they passed those constitutional restrictions back during some oil boom years where they were flush with cash, money wasn't a problem. Well, the oil price dropped, and so of course then revenue dropped. So many school districts in Oklahoma are only going to school 4 days a week to try and save costs. I was reading that there was an interview with a principal, and he was saying that most of his teachers worked 2 and 3 jobs. A lot of them worked part-time at Walmart or being wait staff in restaurants. And he actually said that he was hoping that Walmart wouldn't offer them full-time jobs because it would be more money than teaching at the school.
And Walmart's one of those companies that's notorious for paying their people so little that they have to take welfare. What does
right.
say, Oklahoma? What does that say?
Exactly. So Oklahoma's put itself in this hole, and there's apart from amending the constitution or raising taxes, there's really no hope of reform anytime soon. So to talk about the other state, which is Rhode Island, their problems aren't necessarily limited to the education sphere, where they actually had horribly underfunded pension liabilities for civil servants, particularly police and firemen, where there wasn't going to be money to pay these pensions. And the current governor of Rhode Island, her whole campaign slogan was actually, it's not politics, it's math. Because her whole platform was like, this sucks. This is a terrible situation, but we only have so much money and we have to make cuts. So they have proceeded with very unpopular cuts to these pensions where they're literally taking away money from retired firemen and retired police officers. But in the long run, that means that they're positioned to continue to fund them even at the current levels. They're in a much better position to do that.
Now, this is interesting because Dallas just went through a very similar situation where the firefighters, police officers retirement pension was going to bankrupt the city just to get it back in shape where it should be. And I remember that was even on the ballot during the last election, right. Trying to figure out a way to solve that. And ultimately, I don't know how the Dallas one got resolved. I think the state legislature stepped in and tried to fix it. But this is something that actually is probably happening in a lot of places in America. This is not just happening in faraway places. This happened in essentially the major metropolis that we live in. So something to
these unfunded pension liabilities, it's a problem coast to coast, really countrywide, and the day of reckoning has yet to come.
Yeah, I definitely think we'll see the end of the pension system during our lifetime, which honestly, I think that's probably a smart move because the economy is so volatile and things have changed so much from the 1950s, 60s, 70s when probably a lot of these pensions were first set up. So, you're not always going to be the economic powerhouse that you once were. You don't always have World War II to pull you out of a depression. You got to have a system to take care of your retirees that's feasible.
Right. So would you, I guess, does that mean to be advocating for a public social safety net, sort of like beefed up Social Security kind of thing?
Well, no, I think that these people who are earning a retirement or some type of, pension needs to have the state needs to have an alternative. I think like a 401k or some type of investment where it's not going to be essentially promised money at a certain amount for the rest of the person's life. That's something they contribute to over the course of their employment, and then they get to benefit from it after retirement. I do believe in safe social safety nets. I do believe in Social Security, and I think we need to fix that as well. But I think that's a topic for another time. Anyways, coming back to Rhode Island, they've addressed it, and what were you saying about that?
No, just the last I heard, they addressed the problem, and it's honestly it's unpopular, uh, but it's taking steps to try and solve the problem. So they're positioning themselves into a place where they're going to be able to continue to pay at least some of the pensions rather than just having the money. So
That makes sense.
it's still developing. We'll see where it goes, but it looks like they're doing something.
I mean, sometimes austerity does have to take place if you've overcommitted
Mhm.
yourself. But I also believe that if you are not adequately utilizing taxes, like, Texas, then I think that you've got to also increase taxes. I can't believe we lowered taxes at the national level. That was just absolutely crazy. But we will have to talk
Mhm.
about that another time, probably April, whenever it's tax season. So
There we go. Yeah, we can have a nice Keynesian economics lesson.
there we go. That'll be fun. Now, before we move on, I love Keynesian economics. I was an economics major in undergrad, and I love to argue with the neo-Austrians. They're annoying. But before we move on to the next topic, I'd like to kind of segue for a moment and just ask you, Jay, what is the most ridiculous news article that you saw this week?
The most ridiculous news article I saw this week was the blessing of the AR-15s. Did you see this?
Yeah, I was going to agree with you. This is the most ridiculous article I saw this week as well. Just about it was some type of like mass ceremony where all these people in rural Pennsylvania came together. Was it a marriage? Because I thought I saw somewhere they said it was like a mass marriage and a blessing of their weapons.
I don't know about the marriage. I just saw that it was the blessing of them, and it had been planned for months. So this had nothing to do with what happened in Florida. But just the fact that there are people who worship their guns so obviously, I it it I I just don't know what to say. I don't know what to think.
Well, I did do a little bit of reading, and apparently the guns were supposed to represent a rod of iron in a biblical sense. So, but anyways, this gets back to our ridiculous gun culture in America. This gets back to this idea that the Second Amendment is sacred. It's not sacred. You know, it's from number one, a different time. I think it's very important to our nation's history and to our existence, but you know, we're not dealing with muskets anymore. Seeing those pictures of the M16s or M4s or whatever these people were carrying around, and they're in their Sunday best at church, and it's getting blessed. It's just a ridiculous image. It's something out of like a satirical film about America, and it's real.
Right.
This is an
Right.
Onion article, like incarnate.
When I saw the pictures, I was ready to call fake news, but the source was Reuters, and I, it blew my mind. Just blew my mind. And
But isn't that also ultimately the desire of fake news to undermine our journalism in America?
oh, that no, that's absolutely true. But it made me think of what Tracy Jordan on 30 Rock says about guns,
Yeah.
where someone asks him, "Why are men so obsessed with guns?" And he just says, "Because they're metal penises."
So you're saying that it's just a phallic issue?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, it's just it's the only way that they can feel powerful, and that's just sad.
Well, it's interesting. The comedian, I think his name is Michael Ian Black, recently wrote an article, and it was called, and I believe I'm going off memory here, "The Boys Are Not All Right." And essentially, it says that for the last, few decades, we've had this movement where girls have been told you can do anything, you can be anything, you can achieve, you can have your dreams. And the boys have just been left in this kind of 1950s masculinity driven social outlook. And so we haven't really addressed anything. We haven't addressed how masculinity or, manhood has changed in the 21st century. we don't have anyone talking about these things, and the boys are just left to figure it out on their own. And so I think that's an interesting issue, kind of tying it back into the guns, is that we have a culture that really needs to take a look and see what does it mean to be, an American, to be a man, to be a woman, to live in this society. Do we want to be defined by weapons, or do we want to be defined by art and culture? I mean, we don't always look back at the Romans for being the greatest society, but they did have art and stuff like that. But they did a lot of terrible things. And I feel like we have to realize the future generations may look back at America as a war hungry, gun crazy, very religious place.
Right. I think maybe a term for what you're describing is toxic masculinity.
Toxic masculinity. That's a good term.
Yeah, that might be a kind of a dog whistle term, but there's some questions to be asked about what does it say about our conceptions of masculinity and manhood that forces so many of men to number one, be so angry, and second, to seek outlets for that anger that are so violent.
Yeah, we don't have a great way of dealing with our emotions as men in this country. So, and it gets back to, interestingly enough, that strong silent type being the ideal man, and he's the person who's probably the worst at expressing himself.
Right. And I think that contributing to the problem is that we have so few ways for in this sort of, as what we're referring to as toxic masculinity, there are so few ways for men to have outlets. But one of those accepted ways, one of those accepted outlets for your emotions and your anger is sports.
That's true.
It's not okay to yell and scream at the clerk at Walmart, but it's perfectly okay to yell and scream at the opposing athletes on the basketball court.
You can say things that you would never be able to say to a waitress that has just screwed up your order while you're yelling at the opposing team.
Right. And the cliche of I've only ever seen my dad cry once, and it was when we won the Super Bowl. It's acceptable to release your emotions in a sports context, but not otherwise. And that's so crazy.
But if you look at how popular sports are in America, we can see that this is a very dominant archetype here.
Right. And to talk about the NCAA basketball scandal, this is an intersection of emotion and money, where people are so focused on winning that they will do anything. They will break any rule in order to achieve their goals. We saw this recently with the doping in the Olympics, and in college sports, a lot of it comes in the way of recruiting violations, because in college sports, ostensibly, the athletes are amateurs. They are not paid, but they do receive compensation in the way of an education. So what this creates is a black market for unscrupulous business people to really, it creates a situation that's rife with corruption. So what's been going on with college basketball? Have you been able to follow this at all?
Only tangentially. I remember when actually a lot of the arrests went down back in September. I just happened to be listening to the radio and they were talking about it, and I thought it was interesting that the FBI was arresting people for essentially college basketball bribery.
Right. This story broke back in September 2017 with the FBI announcing that they had, over the last 2 years, been conducting an investigation into college basketball. And what the investigation has centered around was one particular agent and his company. Who this was former NBA agent Andy Miller, along with his associates, a guy named Christian Dawkins. And what they were doing was they were facilitating a situation where agents and financial advisors would pay money to basketball recruits while they were in college or before they were in college, with the understanding that once these players went pro, they would sign with those advisors and agents and pay the money back. And to make things worse, what the rest that you were referring to is they announced indictments against, I think it was 4 assistant basketball coaches who were taking bribes from these financial managers in order to steer the recruits to them. The I think it was the assistant coaches were from Auburn, Oklahoma State, Arizona, and USC. And to make matters worse, this also gets onto a bigger level where Adidas, the worldwide sports equipment manufacturer, has been implicated. Where what Adidas was doing is they were paying the financial advisors to pay the players to sign with Adidas sponsored schools, so that when they're in college, the big stars of basketball are wearing Adidas while they're on the court. And then once they go pro, once again, they sign endorsement deals with Adidas. So to give some examples of what's been uncovered by this investigation, Dennis Smith Jr., the rookie point guard from the Mavericks, is alleged to have received $73,000 while attending North Carolina State. He was there for 1 year. Like all these players, they're one and done. They go to college for 1 year and then go pro, and he received $73,000 in 1 year. There was another player for the Nets, Isaiah Whitehead. He received $37,000 while at Seton Hall. Another guy for the Heat received $36,000 while attending Kentucky. And Rick Pitino, the really legendary coach from Louisville, has been ousted because of his connections with this. So it's the level of corruption being uncovered by this investigation is really kind of shocking.
Well, one of the things that I saw was that up to 50 college basketball programs could be implemented in this investigation. So
Right.
that's a pretty wide breadth across the college basketball system in America. And apparently, out of the top 16 teams in the tournament, almost half have been tied to the investigation. So, I mean, this goes all the way up to the biggest teams out there.
Exactly. Duke, Kentucky, Michigan State, North Carolina. These are the blue bloods of college basketball. These are the big teams and the big brands. And it's just kind of showing, I think, what everybody already knew to begin with, but nobody really wanted to say, is that all these players are getting paid. Especially, I think it's really just limited to the money sports of men's basketball and football. But there's no way that these young men are having the media clout that they have and not getting paid for it. And this investigation, it's just from one dirty agent. So imagine the other dirty agents, not just in basketball, but in football and beyond.
Mm. Now, this, in my mind, raises an interesting question. Like you said at the beginning, college basketball is an amateur sport. Amateur generally means that you don't get paid, and that's what distinguishes it between professional. But there's so much money in college basketball, and we know that that money is not going to lower tuition. That's not going to, pay for anything to help the school outside of probably, maybe store up in their war chest or buy new facilities. But it does raise the question, maybe should we eliminate that aspect of amateur sports? Should the players get to benefit from their natural talent, since they're not staying at the school? They're not getting an education. They're going on into professional. Is this really a regulation that we need to have?
Exactly. And to illustrate part of the one of the most ridiculous parts of college sports, none of these players, ostensibly by the school, are getting paid. They're not a single dollar from the millions of dollars being made on the TV contracts, the sponsors, everything. None of that's going to the players. But let me ask you, do you happen to know who the highest paid state employee of the state of Texas is?
UT football coach.
Well, yeah, exactly. We're kind of giving it away by talking about college sports, but it's the football coach, and
He's paid more than the governor.
oh yeah, absolutely.
Oh my
And
gosh.
because of some recent developments, it's actually the coach at Texas A&M. But the point is still valid. It's the I think the guy at A&M is going to he's making $75 million over 10 years. So 7.5 mil a year. The guy at UT is I think he's in like the $5 million range. The governor, I don't know for sure, but I bet it's less than a million. There's no way we pay our governor $1 million because the governor of Texas doesn't do anything.
Also, God, if we paid Rick Perry over $1 million just to be governor,
Kill me.
And he burnt down the governor's mansion. Gosh, what an idiot.
I forgot about that.
What? Oh gosh, I don't have good things to say about Rick Perry. So let's move on from that subject.
Oh, yes.
Now, this is interesting though, because now that the FBI is involved, this definitely makes the NCAA look really bad. So don't we think that the NCAA is going to probably have like an about face, a hard turn to address these issues, this widespread apparent issue in college basketball?
Absolutely. I hope so. Whenever the NCAA is coming down on a program for violations, one of their favorite terms of art to use is a lack of systemic control. That's usually the most severe accusation the NCAA can make against a school, saying that you lost control of the situation to the point that people were breaking the rules and you didn't even care. And that's exactly the situation going on at the level of the NCAA now, that there has been a lack of institutional control by the governing body to rein in these problems. And the normal punishments for these kinds of infractions are things like taking away scholarships. They expunge wins from the records of teams. And it's just so ridiculous that these punishments, the taking away the scholarships, and the restrictions on the teams, those are really just hurting the players.
Yeah, that doesn't hurt the businesses and doesn't hurt the coaches or anything.
It's not putting any pressure on the people who caused the problem, and then the forfeiting of the wins is just such a ridiculous ridiculous punishment because it's not a real one. Like, for example, the coach
if
that
they
I
were
mentioned
fixing the games, then yeah, I could see them forfeiting the win. But just for taking some money on the side, you still won that game.
Well, my point is that that's really no deterrent. Because, for example, the coach that I mentioned who got fired, Rick Pitino, he coached at Louisville, and they won the championship in 2013. But because of these violations, they have had to forfeit those wins. But it's not like they went into the memory of everyone. We're like, forget that Louisville won that year. Ooh, no, everybody knows that happens. Yeah, they just can't put up a banner anymore. It's so dumb that the NCAA is a completely toothless organization, and yet they make such incredible money, especially off of the basketball tournament coming up in a couple of weeks. It's such an unfair situation that there's so much money being made, and it's not going to the people who are actually doing the work to create that entire economy.
Do you think that the NCAA should have any culpability to the federal government for its failure to properly police itself? Because remember, the NCAA fits a unique kind of category in American law. It's essentially a private monopoly on college basketball. And it's the NCAA is not run by the schools, but don't they vote people into it? The members?
I don't know the specifics of how the NCAA is run, but I think you're right that it's
when you're a monopoly, you get to play. You have to play by different rules, otherwise the Anti-Sherman Act comes hammering down on you.
Right. Whether or not they are going to be responsible to the federal government, I really doubt it. Probably just kind of going back to our theme of corruption, in that they are so powerful that I really doubt that they'll have anybody come after them. And the federal indictments, and I think the reason why the FBI is involved is really about the bribing of the coaches to steer the players both towards the agents and towards the sports companies,
Because
because
they're
that,
state officials.
and that amounts to wire frauds, because if you know anything about white collar crime, everything is wire fraud.
Everything is wire fraud, and on most things are also mail fraud.
Yeah, exactly. So it's going to be interesting to see if they're convicted, because I think we're just at the indictment stage so far. But we will see. This scandal has really, I think it's another, we've just hit the tip of the iceberg, and there's going to be a lot more to come.
Now, do you think, kind of as a closing thought, living in Dallas, you always hear about the death penalty sanction that SMU got. Do you think
Right.
that any of the schools' conduct was egregious enough to warrant some type of death penalty, or was this more just really these few assistant coaches and this agent?
Well, real quick, just in case anybody doesn't really follow sports, when we refer to the death penalty, what that means is that because of violations in the 80s, SMU's football program was completely shut down for a couple of years. That's what we mean when we say the death penalty. And the prevailing opinions, the kind of old advice on all the sports chatter is that the death penalty decimated SMU's programs so badly that the NCAA is never going to do that again. That they're going to do everything that they can to avoid that sort of situation. And I think that's probably right, because what most people point to is that Penn State, they had the assistant coach who was sexually assaulting underage boys. That was way worse than what SMU was doing, which was just paying players. But they didn't shut down the Penn State football program. So I don't think we're going to get the death penalty. There's actually some of the details about Louisville is that some more of their violations was that they were caught arranging for strippers to entertain recruits, and they were actually caught even paying for the strippers to have sex with the recruits. We're talking about like 17-year-old boys going on recruiting trips to colleges, and Louisville's buying them hookers. But as for the punishments, I think it's really just going to be the same old, restrictions on postseason play, taking away wins, restricting scholarships, the kind of thing that doesn't actually force any kind of meaningful change.
Yeah, I think the only thing here that we can point to that might change conduct is that the FBI actually got involved. So probably less coaches being bribed and more private individuals.
Right.
So, well, that's unfortunate, but this is something that happens in sports. And when you have a giant capitalistic society that makes money off of those sports, then there is a risk that people are going to try and break the system.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. So before we get to our last topic, I'd like to try out a segment and see how it goes. And I want to call this Arbitrary and Capricious Viewer Questions.
Okay.
So I want to encourage our listeners to send in their arbitrary and capricious questions. Any question you feel like, we're open books, kind of ask me anything.
And we have a Twitter. We have a Twitter now. So if you want to tweet us, that is a perfectly viable way to contact us. And next time when we are doing the podcast, if there are any outstanding questions on the Twitter feed, we will answer them.
Yes, we will. So that you can contact us at our email address, which is it arbitrary and capricious podcast at gmail.com?
I believe it's arbitrary capricious podcast at gmail.com. And then
there we go.
Twitter handle.
Twitter handle is at ArbCap Podcast. So at ARBCAP Podcast. That's where you can find us on Twitter. So for a question for this week, Aaron, what's your thoughts on reclining seats on airplanes? Yay or nay?
So my experience with airplanes is very unusual. I grew up, my father had his private pilot license, so we flew in little airplanes, which did not have reclining seats. And they always seemed to be, number one, from the 70s, and number two, very uncomfortable. So my initial reaction would be, yes, reclining seats would be awesome. But I've also been on recent international flights and across the Atlantic, and not having leg room or knee room due to the person in front of you essentially sawing logs is really annoying. And so, unless you are sitting in first class or you are sitting in some type of nicer uh, coach or something like that, I feel like the reclining seats are a little bit uncomfortable for everyone else around you. So that's at least my thought. I remember at one point I was watching something and the guy leaned his seat back in front of me, and all of a sudden, like, my hands had to just get closer to my face because now there was a seat in front of me. So, what about you? What do you think about reclining seats?
Well, I just want to say, you, sir, are a true man of the people with your experience on private jets and transatlantic flights.
Private airplanes. These are single engine 1970 P210s. These are not sophisticated airplanes, but I have memories of as a 7-year-old and my dad's banking around to land the airplane, and we're essentially sideways, and my face is leaning up against the window, looking down at the ground straight down. So weird childhood. Planes have never been an issue for me. Heights, that doesn't bother me. I think I was kind of forced to just deal with that. So,
there you go.
But
well, for me, I've got kind of a personal rule about a 4-hour rule of thumb, where if the flight is under 4 hours, I do not myself recline out of respect to the people behind me. But if it's over 4 hours, we'll see. We'll see how I feel. But on the flip side, I also understand that the person in front of me has every right to recline. That, the button's there. The person who designed the airplane gave them that option. There's nothing I can do about it. So, go ahead, buddy. I don't really like it, but, you do you.
And trust me, I've seen people on airplanes. They are definitely doing themselves. So,
oh, yeah.
It's a lot of, like pajamas. That's like apparently now how you fly. The 1950s, you wore a suit, you wore a nice hat. 2018, it's pajamas. That is how most people fly these days.
Oh, yeah. A lot of yoga pants, a lot of leggings, a lot of bare feet.
A lot of bare feet. Which, yeah. I guess, maybe if you have to go through the security and they make you take your shoes off, you kind of skip a step.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this: what's your feelings of taking off the shoes on a road trip?
I personally don't have any issue with it. The only thing I have a problem with are the people who sit in the front passenger seat with their feet off and they put their feet on the dash. Number one, I don't really care. Doesn't really gross me out. Feet, that's not something that bothers me. But I just constantly have this mental image of the airbag malfunctioning and it going off, and now all of a sudden their feet are going through their face with a nice cushy pillow forcing it to happen. So I just get nervous about that. So, take your shoes off, relax, enjoy on the trip, but please don't put it up on the dashboard. That bothers me.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that 100%. Because recently I took a short little road trip down to Waco and back to go to a basketball game. And my buddy was sitting shotgun, and I look over and he's taken off his shoes and had them up on the dash. And they were suspiciously and precariously close to the vents. And, that's...
So there was an odor problem, is what you were saying.
There was an odor problem there. And I kind of felt like... maybe that was sort of a permission of the driver kind of situation.
I definitely generally believe that the common law of the car is whoever is the driver. So if you don't allow that to happen in your car and you're driving, that is the rule that holds.
Yeah, absolutely. But to maybe open up a little window into myself, when I was a kid, we did a lot of road trips, and oftentimes my feet would actually smell so badly that my parents would insist that I slept with my shoes on in the car. So that was a long time ago. Feet. Yeah, that was a long time ago. I like to think that I've made strides in my personal foot care since then.
Yeah, no, going on road trips with the family, that's always a fun thing. Living in Texas, going to the mall can be a road trip just because how everything is spread out, especially growing up in the 90s and DFW, the suburbs. You have to drive all the way across town just to go to Walmart.
Yeah, it's nothing but
So
sprawl.
it's nothing but sprawl, you know. So I have friends that are not from Texas, and they come here and they're like, everything's so spread out. I'm like, yeah, like
Yeah.
to go to church, I crossed 3 towns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's crazy.
It's an unusual place.
Uh, but speaking of topics that stink, what did you want to talk about guns this week, or did we cover it
So
earlier?
no, I definitely want to talk about guns, and this won't be a long segment, but a couple of things that happened last week or after our last podcast was that Dick's Sporting Goods, Walmart, and Kroger, which apparently has a subsidiary that sells guns, have now changed their store policy and will no longer sell guns to anyone under the age of 21, regardless of state law. So
Is it
even
all
if
guns like periods, or is it just assault rifles?
I think it's all guns, period. And then
Oh,
Dick
nice.
said that we don't sell those guns anymore. But any of our subsidiaries that do sell those guns, we're going to go ahead and end that practice as well. So that's pretty interesting. Additionally, Dick's took it a step further. They also made an affirmative statement saying we believe that our lawmakers should pass sensible gun reform, and even encouraged an assault weapon ban. Now that to me was probably one of the biggest steps. Whenever businesses are coming out and they're in favor of assault weapon bans and they make money off of guns, this is a part of their industry, and they're advocating for a ban. That means that there is a cultural shift going on in America. And this is very interesting. And as we know from Citizens United, famous case that allowed money to go all over politics, corporations have First Amendment rights. They get to speak. And which is funny, all these people complaining about Dick's Sporting Goods having an opinion about gun sales. But I think that's something really important. I think that's something that we should be watching, is since the politicians have failed to do anything after every single shooting, the businesses are stepping up. You know, how many businesses have cut ties with the NRA? You know, and Delta, they got penalized by I believe it was the Alabama or the Georgia legislature. Georgia, they cut a tax that would have benefited Delta out of their new, I guess, budget proposal or whatever. And Delta's response, was stone cold. They're like, our values are not for sale, Georgia. You know,
Excellent response, Delta.
Excellent response, Delta. I will fly Delta just because of that response.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I probably will fly the cheapest option available at the moment, but I definitely have strong feelings about that. And you know, I believe you brought up the point that why didn't we see, like, you know, the NRA getting mad at other airlines, and it was that, you know, American and United didn't even have deals.
It was American and Southwest are the ones who didn't have any deals with the NRA to begin with.
So, I mean, the fact that all these businesses are cutting ties with the NRA, that even governmental pressure from a deep red state did not flip Delta back. The fact that, you know, Dick's, Walmart, massive sporting goods, you know, companies are taking upon themselves to regulate the sale of guns. This is, in my opinion, just evidence of changes in our culture. This last shooting, something has changed. Something has finally hit, you know, the American psyche that says we got to do something about this. You know, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really don't want to underplay at all the significance of what's going on with Delta and the state, because Delta they operate their hub out of Atlanta. That's like their base of operations. They're headquartered there. You know, that's the biggest airport in the world, the most people going through it every day. And what the tax was, I think they were going to make Delta exempt from fuel taxes. They were going to have to pay
fuel tax
on jet fuel at their biggest hub. So this is something that's going to hit them hard. This is big. And I just want to kind of shine the light on the legislature and say, what a dick move. You gave them this tax break as the sweetheart deal, being, you know, you are a major employer in the state. You account for massive economic activity. You employ tens of thousands of people and make a massive impact in this community. You know, here's a break to make sure that you continue to have a community commitment to this community. Oh wait, you're not going to give us discounts on NRA flights anymore. Well, never mind. All of that goodwill, it's not worth anything anymore. And that is,
Absolutely.
I want to put the Georgia legislature on blast, as the kids are saying.
As the kids are saying, I think that's very appropriate. I mean, that's what the First Amendment is for. Number one, government criticism. But this is even crazier when you think about this is a legislature retaliating against an individual organization for exercising their rights. This is retaliatory. Remember this. Remember this, that this is the way that they are running the states. Petty. This is petty. Petty. People need to wake up and realize that whenever they care more about guns than jobs, I don't need to be banging on my desk. Whenever they care more about guns than jobs, that is not who you want running your state. And honestly, even if you're a gun owner, Delta is a company about airplanes. They do flights. They have nothing to do with guns. They were doing you a favor giving you that deal. That's not you're not owed that. You want to talk about entitlements? Come on.
Yeah, exactly. And I brought up in the first place because I wanted to sort of shout out to American and Southwest for, Delta's getting all this press for resisting, and you know what? Shout out to the ones who didn't have ties in the first place, because that's just as good, if not better.
Yeah. Now this also brings up another interesting thing that's been happening this last week. I never like to talk about this person, but he's at least in the news. Alex Jones got multiple strikes for accusing the Parkland students of being crisis actors. And by strikes, I mean strikes on his YouTube channel, and is currently suspended for 2 weeks due to his statements. Now, he's gone on to Twitter and specifically sent messages to, I believe it's Ryan Hogg, one of the students that has been really active after the Parkland shooting, and has requested a debate with him. So if that actually happens and a 16-year-old like mass shooting survivor goes on to debate Alex Jones, number one, I think the kid's going to absolutely whoop his ass. But I mean, honestly, you just listen to anything that he says. He's hardly coherent.
Yeah.
But number two, how low have you sunk, man? That you are wanting to debate a 20 or a 16-year-old on YouTube because you think he's a crisis actor? This is a reprehensible opinion that you have, and that's why you are getting essentially crapped on by YouTube. It's not because there's some grand conspiracy. It's because you're just a terrible human being.
Well, let me ask you something. Let's say they do set up this debate. They are successful in making this happen. Are you going to watch it?
I would watch it.
And
it
that's
works.
Why
it would work.
You say, how low have you sunk? Well, he's an entertainer.
I would, but see, I wouldn't continue watching him after that. And that's the problem, is I would only watch it. It's like, I grew up going to an evangelical church and DFW. I'm not going to say which one, but they would have events, big nights for the youth, and it would be like a movie theme night. It was like the Matrix night or some stuff like that. And you'd have a bunch of people show up, and then the next week they're all gone because they came for the movie. They came for, the big event. That's not how you keep people, And so that's a really, really poor strategy if you're trying to get sustainable listeners. If you're just trying to be in the news to be in the news, I guess that would work.
There's no such thing as bad press, I think, is the since November 2016 has been the prevailing public opinion.
Unless you're CNN. Oh!
Ooh.
That was a Trump joke. So the bad press, the fake news.
Oh yeah,
well,
naturally.
I think that, number one, people like Alex Jones contribute to this ridiculous conspiracy theory society that has developed over the last I mean, we've always had conspiracy theories in America. JFK, Abraham Lincoln, the moon landing wasn't real, whatever. But I don't know about you, but in recent years, it just seems like it's on crack cocaine.
Mm-hmm.
Like stuff that just outrageous stuff. Outrageous stuff. And I don't want to get into it. We need to have an entire podcast where we just criticize all the ridiculous conspiracy theories.
Yeah, actually, I've been listening to a podcast called Slow Burn. That's been really good. I'd really recommend it to anybody out there. But one of the things that they said in that podcast is that there was an explosion of belief in conspiracy theories after Watergate, because it got to the point where it was like Watergate was a conspiracy theory. It was, oh man, the president has this shadowy council of people who are breaking into their opponents' offices. Ooh, and at first people were like, no, that's crazy. And then it turned out it was true. So it's almost like, if that could be true, maybe we did fake the moon landings. Maybe the CIA really did create HIV, which it didn't. But that they sort of traced a lot of the explosion of the conspiracy theories back to Watergate.
So what is the event that triggered the conspiracy theories this time? It's Obama.
9/11, maybe?
No, it's going to be Obama. Oh, that's a good guess. I think that 9/11, there was definitely the whole loose change, which is, once again, Alex Jones people, like the 9/11 conspiracies. He was a big proponent of that. Realized this is his niche, is conspiracy theory crazy crap. Whenever his listeners are a pillar of your base Republican Party, this is why we're begging for you to fix education.
Mm-hmm.
Oh
yeah. Do you ever listen to talk radio?
No, not anymore. My dad listens to talk radio, and he's a staunch liberal. My father is a super liberal individual. And I asked him, I said, why do you listen to Rush Limbaugh and all these other guys? Well, I have to know what the enemy's saying. So that's how hardcore liberal my father is. But anytime I listen to it with him, it just is very shouty and annoying.
Right. But the next time you have to listen to it, I want you to pay attention to the ads.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's all fear-mongering. It's all, buy gold because the economy is about to crash. Buy this security system for your home because someone's going to break into it. And then another staple of it is those bullshit supplements. The feed this to your dog and it's going to, take 2 years off of its aging. Take this capsule of super vegetables and you're not going to have to take medicine for diabetes anymore.
Wow. And the conservative talk show hosts are selling unregulated supplements on their, advertisements. It's crazy.
Oh, yeah. I would, if you ever have the time, actually watch InfoWars, because half of it is Alex Jones trying to sell his own line of supplements. And I think that speaks to the anti-intellectualism of the people who follow that shit, because rather than solving your diabetes by diet and exercise and medication from your doctor, it's no, take this capsule that we swear is full of super vegetables.
Yeah, 99% sawdust and 1% super vegetable.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, there's a great bit, and if you have the time, go watch it on YouTube. But not Eric Wareheim, but Tim Heidecker from Tim and Eric actually went to the Republican National Convention and somehow found the live correspondence for the InfoWars while he was there, and started doing his Alex Jones impression while walking around the camera, and is just raving about supplements, and he's holding a bag of pills and is talking about them. So it's is
Tim the tall one or the short one?
Tim is the one without glasses. He's the short one.
Gotcha. Okay. Gotcha.
So, and he sounds just like Alex Jones, identical. So definitely something worth watching. But I think this is definitely something that we have to be thankful for, comedians, the late night people who poke fun at this ridiculous aspect of our society on a weekly basis. Because, honestly, when you watch it, if you don't think it's a joke, it is insanity. Have you seen the video compilations of Alex Jones talking about genetic experiment quasi pig people, the gay frogs? And
Yeah.
number one, the fact that they auto-tune that stuff is hilarious. But
Yes.
but the content exists. He's talking about this stuff, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and people are
Mm-hmm.
listening. People are
Yeah.
listening.
Well, let me pose a question to you then. You started off by introducing Alex Jones, talking about how he was being censored by YouTube. So censorship by corporations, good thing, bad thing.
Um, this is a difficult subject because when we talk about free speech, we are always talking about governmental censorship of the individual. You always have the right to go out to public places and say whatever you want to say as long as you follow the regulations that have been constitutionally approved. It's a little disclaimer for you. But you sign up and agree to certain standards when you join YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, whatever. And since it is a private platform and you are posting stuff through that private platform, they have the authority and right to self-police the content that is on their page. And
Sure, but my question is, should they?
yeah,
Is
I
that
think
is that good for us? Is that bad for us?
I think this gets back to I think that the corporation aspect of it, you have every right to go and create infowars.com and upload all your videos. You have that right. YouTube has a broader platform of access, and so you benefit by being able to upload it to YouTube. Because of that benefit, YouTube makes money and they have the right and authority to police it. I definitely think that YouTube has the right to make a policy decision on what gets uploaded to their website. And I think that you agree that they ultimately have the final say on something if it violates their policy. Now, that's the whole point is you still have the right to make your video and post it on the internet, but you're not going to have the access. So that's why they're upset. So I don't have any problem with Facebook, Twitter, anyone censoring anything on their own platform because you have remedies. You are not left silenced.
Right. I think that's really key here is that there's plenty of competitors that if you get kicked off of YouTube, you can just go somewhere else.
Yeah, you can go join like the alt-right Twitter or whatever it's called.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember. I'm not going to remember those names because they're not worth thinking about. But
Mm-hmm.
you can also join the Trump follower dating website, which is apparently ridiculous.
Ooh, wow.
That's
We
a
should go
thing.
undercover, like create profiles and see what we find out.
Oh, the worst thing about it is that the person that they put on the homepage of the website,
Is it
convicted
Ivanka?
sex, no, convicted sex offender. He's
Oh
he's he's on the
no.
cover. He's a convicted sex offender, and that was the biggest news
Come
about the
on.
website. Like this,
How do you
this is the biggest argument against the conspiracy or collaboration with Russia, the investigation, whatever, is that they're just too incompetent to
Yeah.
to do this.
Mhm.
But maybe it's feigned incompetence. I don't know.
Yeah, that's definitely true. That's really one way to hide your true motivations is just play the fool, act like an idiot. Nobody, oh God, what is it? There's some show where they're like, oh, it's The Office, the one where Nellie is gonna chop off Dwight's hand because she prints off her plan in Comic Sans, and they're like, oh, nobody with a real plan would use such a ridiculous font. And then it's her saying, no one thinks you have a plan when you use a ridiculous font. So I think most likely they're actually too incompetent and it's not feigned.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately. No, but I think that he probably has done other things and probably out of fear has done things to try and make things not look as bad as they look. Which, what do they say? The cover up's always worse.
The cover up is always worse.
Cover up's always worse. So, with that, that is the last topic we have for today. Before we go, I'd like to just reiterate contact us via YouTube comments, via our Twitter. Our handle is at AbCap Podcast.
Arbcap.
So, ArbCap, man, sorry, I'm tired. It has been a long day. ArbCap at ArbCap Podcast. That is not an easy thing to say. So we thank you for sticking with us with our ridiculous name, our arbitrarily capricious name. And we will have a Facebook page up probably this week. So if you like what you're listening to, like us on YouTube, on Facebook, Twitter. We will update probably weekly at our current rate. So we enjoy talking, and we hope you enjoy listening.
Yeah, thank you for listening. And for Arbitrary and Capricious, this is Jay.
This is Aaron. Have a great day.